Real mobsters, real history. Welcome to the underworld. The 2nd of May, 1972. Inside the Oval Office, Richard Nixon, the most powerful man on the planet, receives a phone call. The man who has terrified Washington for half a century is dead. Nixon goes on television and calls him a giant. But behind closed doors, the president is sweating. He paces the room. He curses. He desperately asks his aides one single, panicked question. Where are the files? Because across town, inside FBI headquarters, a 5-year-old secretary is not crying over her dead boss. Her name is Helen Gandy, and she is shredding. For weeks, she feeds thousands of documents into destruction bins, wiretap logs, photographs, blackmail on presidents, civil rights leaders, and Hollywood royalty. Secrets that could burn America to the ground. This is the true story of J. Edgar Hoover, not the sanitized Hollywood version. This is the story of a paranoid bureaucrat who didn't just hunt criminals. He hunted the truth, locked it in a cabinet, and became the most dangerous unelected dictator in American history. Born the 1st of January 1895, just 3 blocks behind the United States Capitol, John Edgar Hoover was not a physically imposing kid. He was shy. He had a severe, crippling stutter. Other children might have accepted the handicap. Hoover attacked it. He forced himself to speak fast. Machine gun fast. He didn't cure the stutter. He outran it. It was his very first exercise in absolute psychological control. As a teenager, he took a job as a messenger at the Library of Congress. This is where the monster was truly born. Hoover didn't just learn the cataloging system. He worshipped it. He looked at the endless rows of data and realized a terrifying truth. Human beings are exactly like books. Everyone has a card, everyone belongs in a category. And if you have the right index, everyone can be filed, sorted, and controlled. In June 1919, a bomb detonated on the front porch of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer in Washington. It was part of a coordinated terror wave across 7 cities. America was bleeding, and the country was drowning in panic. Palmer needed a weapon. He found it in a 2-4-year-old Justice Department lawyer with a bulldog jaw and a photographic memory. He put Hoover in charge of the new radical division. His mandate was simple. Find the anarchists, find the communists, purge them from the country. Hoover did not pick up a gun. He picked up a pen. Using his library training, Hoover built a weaponized database. He personally compiled a card index of 450,000 suspected radicals, 450,000 names, hand-typed, cross-referenced, tracked. He did this in under 2 years. He was only 25 years old. Then, he pulled the trigger. In November 1919, and again in January 1920, federal agents kicked down doors in more than 30 cities. This was the infamous Palmer raids. Agents arrested up to 10,000 people. Most had no warrants. Most committed no crime. They were dragged from their beds, held in freezing, filthy rooms for days without lawyers, without food, without a single phone call. While innocent immigrants shivered in holding cells, Hoover sat in his pristine office. And pristine is not an exaggeration. The man building a surveillance empire was deeply, fundamentally broken by obsessive-compulsive paranoia. Hoover was a massive germaphobe. He installed ultraviolet air purifiers in his office to burn away bacteria. He refused to step on cracks in the sidewalk. He ordered his chauffeurs never to make left turns, paralyzed by the irrational fear of a side impact collision. His physical demands on his agents bordered on delusion. He fired men for having sweaty palms. He strictly banned agents with small heads, completely possessed by a bizarre phobia of what he called pinheads. The man who demanded absolute perfection from the American public was a prisoner to his own frantic, terrifying mind. Eventually, the Palmer raids collapsed in scandal. The arrests were deemed legally worthless. Attorney General Palmer's career was instantly destroyed. But the architect of the raids, Hoover walked away without a scratch. He testified before Congress with icy, dead-eyed composure. He blamed the illegal excesses on local police. He blamed the politicians. He survived. On the 10th of May 1924, Hoover was officially named director of the Bureau of Investigation. He was 29 years old. He would never leave that office alive. Hoover had learned his ultimate lesson. Whoever controls the files, controls the fear. But a hunter is nothing without his prey. To make his new FBI untouchable, Hoover needed monsters. And luckily for him, the 1930s were about to hand him an army of them. The early 1930s. America was starving. The Great Depression had hollowed out the country, leaving millions desperate and furious. And out of that desperation, a new kind of celebrity was born. The bank robber. John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Babyface Nelson, Bonnie Parker, and Clyde Barrow. To the starving farmers, these were not criminals. They were folk heroes. They were hitting the banks that had just foreclosed on their homes. The newspapers turned them into legends. Hoover saw this, and his massive ego flared. He realized that to defeat a celebrity, he had to build a bigger one. The first thing Hoover did to combat the crime wave was not a tactical overhaul. It was a wardrobe change. Hoover shrank the bureau. He fired anyone who did not fit his exact, obsessive aesthetic. To be an FBI agent, you had to be a white male, college-educated, preferably a lawyer or an accountant. You wore a dark suit, a crisp white shirt, a fedora. You did not drink on duty. You did not grow a mustache. You stayed exactly within your weight limit. Hoover was not building a police force. He was building a brand. The G-Man, the government man, untouchable, incorruptible, and completely obedient. But looking the part was not enough. Hoover needed absolute federal authority. When the infant son of aviation hero Charles Lindbergh was kidnapped and murdered in 1932, Hoover struck. He relentlessly lobbied Congress. He pushed the public panic to a boiling point. The result was the Lindbergh Law, making kidnapping across state lines a federal crime. Shortly after, bank robbery and fleeing across state lines became federal crimes too. Hoover asked for the world. Congress gave it to him. Now, he had the power. He just needed a trophy. The 22nd of July, 1934, Chicago, Illinois. The Biograph Theater. John Dillinger, public enemy number one, stepped out onto the humid pavement wearing a straw hat. Federal agents were waiting in the shadows. 20 seconds later, Dillinger was face down in a filthy alley, bleeding to death from 3 gunshot wounds. The ambush was a massive victory for the Bureau. But for Hoover, it created a massive problem. The agent who led the ambush was a man named Melvin Purvis. Purvis was young, handsome, and fiercely competent. Overnight, the American press turned Purvis into a god. Kids wanted to be him. Hollywood actors modeled their characters after him. The spotlight, which Hoover believed belonged exclusively to him, was shining on someone else. Hoover's reaction was swift, silent, and brutal. He did not tolerate rivals, not inside his bureau, not ever. Hoover immediately began a campaign of psychological torture against his own star agent. He buried Purvis in meaningless paperwork. He reassigned him to dead-end tasks across the country. He sent inspectors to harass him. He spread vicious rumors about Purvis's competence. Within a year, Purvis was completely broken. He resigned in disgrace. The Bureau erased him. When Purvis tried to find work in private security, Hoover personally blocked his employment. The hero who killed John Dillinger was blacklisted by his own boss. In 1960, Melvin Purvis was found dead in his home from a gunshot wound to the head. It was officially ruled a suicide. The FBI did not send flowers. They did not send a representative to the funeral. Hoover simply noted that his former rival was finally gone. Hoover had conquered the bank robbers. His face was on every comic book and newspaper. But while he was chasing gangsters with machine guns for the cameras, he was turning completely blind to a much darker, much more organized shadow creeping across America. The real monsters were taking over, and the ultimate lawman refused to look. For 3 decades, J. Edgar Hoover stood in front of microphones and told the American public a blatant, undeniable lie. There is no national crime syndicate. While the FBI chased small-time bank robbers across the Midwest, a massive, highly organized, ultra-violent shadow government was carving up the United States. La Cosa Nostra, the American Mafia. They were building a multi-billion-dollar empire built on narcotics, gambling, extortion, and blood. Local police forces knew they existed. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics knew they existed. Investigative journalists were writing front-page exposes about them. But the director of the FBI? He shook his head. He insisted they were just isolated, local hoodlums. Nothing to worry about. Why? Why would the ultimate lawman, a man obsessed with control and federal jurisdiction, completely ignore the most dangerous criminal enterprise on the planet? For years, historians offered polite excuses. They claimed Hoover was afraid the Mafia would corrupt his pristine agents, just like Prohibition had corrupted local cops. They claimed Hoover didn't want to fight a war he wasn't guaranteed to win, because losing would damage his carefully crafted G-Man brand. But in the ruthless, transactional world of Washington, polite excuses rarely cover the truth. Hoover did not ignore the mob out of incompetence. He ignored them out of self-preservation. In the underworld, whispers began to circulate, and those whispers belonged to men who did not bluff. Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, the architects of the National Syndicate, the financial brains of the Mafia. According to deeply entrenched rumors that terrified the highest levels of the Justice Department, Lansky and Costello had acquired the ultimate insurance policy against the FBI. Blackmail. The rumors pointed to a specific event at the luxurious Plaza Hotel in New York City. Hoover, always fiercely protective of his private life, had allegedly been photographed in a highly compromising position. He was reportedly wearing women's clothing, cross-dressing, accompanied by his male subordinate. In the 1930s and 40s, releasing those photographs would not just end a career, it would destroy a life. It would result in federal charges. It would obliterate the untouchable legacy Hoover had sacrificed everything to build. Did the Mafia actually have the photos? We may never know for certain, but we know how power works. The Mafia never killed J. Edgar Hoover. They didn't have to. They just kept him on a leash. For 30 years, the deadliest criminal syndicate in history operated with total impunity, entirely undisturbed by the federal government. But on the 14th of November 1957, the Mafia made a fatal mistake. Deep in the woods of upstate New York, at a sprawling estate in Appalachian, more than 60 of the most powerful Mafia bosses in the country gathered for a secret summit. Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino. They were there to divide territory and settle disputes. But a suspicious local state trooper stumbled onto the meeting. When backup arrived, total chaos erupted. Dozens of mobsters, the most lethal men in America, went sprinting through the muddy woods, wearing silk suits, fedoras, and expensive Italian dress shoes. They were rounded up and arrested by local cops. The Appalachian meeting was front-page news across the globe. It exposed the National Syndicate overnight. The undeniable proof was finally on the table. Hoover was trapped. He could no longer deny the Mafia existed. So, he did what he did best. He completely rewrote history. Hoover quietly ordered the FBI to create a top hoodlum program. He never publicly admitted he had been wrong for 30 years. He never apologized. He simply pivoted the machine, aimed it at the men he had protected, and started claiming credit for a war he had absolutely refused to fight. The Mafia knew the golden rule of Washington. To neutralize a monster, you just need a bigger secret. But Hoover wasn't just hiding from the mob. The greatest secret of his life, the one that dictated his every waking moment, was the exact same crime he was destroying thousands of lives to punish. To understand the true darkness of J. Edgar Hoover, you have to look at the man in the mirror, and the reflection is completely shattered. For the first 43 years of his life, the most feared man in Washington did not live in a sprawling mansion or a luxury penthouse. He lived in a modest house on Seward Square with his mother, Annie Marie. He never married. He never had a documented romantic relationship with a woman. When Annie Marie died in 1938, Hoover was emotionally destroyed. He wept openly at her funeral, a rare crack in his icy armor. But he was not alone. By then, one man had already become the absolute center of his private world. His name was Clyde Tolson. Tolson was a young, handsome agent hired in 1928. In just 3 years, he skyrocketed past veteran agents to become Hoover's second-in-command. They were inseparable. The bond went far beyond professional loyalty. It was a total, lifelong partnership that defined everything Hoover did. Every morning, Hoover and Tolson rode to work together. Every afternoon, they ate lunch together. Almost every evening, they sat at the exact same table at Harvey's restaurant on Connecticut Avenue and ate dinner together. They went to the horse races at Del Mar together. They vacationed in Miami together, lounging on the beach while photographers snapped pictures of the two top cops in America. In the hyper-masculine, rigidly controlled halls of FBI headquarters, terrified staff members quietly referred to them as J. Edna and Mother Tolson. Whether their relationship was physically intimate has been debated by historians for 50 years, but the physical details do not matter. The historical record is crystal clear. When Hoover died, he did not leave his estate to the FBI or the government. He left the bulk of his massive fortune to Clyde Tolson. Tolson inherited Hoover's house. He inherited Hoover's money. He accepted the folded American flag draped over Hoover's coffin. Tolson moved into Hoover's house and lived there until he died 3 years later. Today, they are buried just a few yards apart in the Congressional Cemetery. By any reasonable definition, J. Edgar Hoover was a man who spent his entire adult life in a deeply committed, primary relationship with another man. And this is where the story turns truly evil. Because while Hoover was vacationing with Tolson and enjoying the absolute protection of his power, he was running a systematic, ruthless machine designed to completely destroy people just like him. In 1953, President Dwight Eisenhower signed Executive Order 10450. It banned homosexuals from working in the federal government, labeling them as security risks. Hoover did not just enforce this order, he weaponized it. He personally supervised a massive, covert FBI operation known as the Sex Deviates program. Hoover's agents hunted down suspected gay men and women across the country. They tapped their phones. They interrogated them in small, windowless rooms. They harassed their families. They threatened their landlords. From 1951 until the mid-1970s, Hoover's FBI compiled over 330,000 pages of material exclusively focusing on the sexual preferences of American citizens. The results were devastating. Thousands of careers were instantly terminated. Families were violently broken apart. People who had served their country with honor were blacklisted, publicly humiliated, and driven into absolute despair. There were suicides. Quiet, desperate suicides that never made the front pages of the newspapers. All because Hoover decided their private lives made them a threat to the nation. It was the ultimate hypocrisy. The man pulling the levers of the machine had every reason to be terrified of his own list. Psychologists call it projection. When a man is deeply ashamed of who he is, he violently attacks that exact trait in others. Hoover built a glass house, and then he bought a machine gun. He destroyed thousands of lives to build a firewall around his own. Armed with this absolute mastery of blackmail, fear, and hypocrisy, Hoover was no longer satisfied with hunting street thugs or purging government clerks. He was ready for the ultimate prize. He was not just controlling agents anymore. He was about to put a leash on the presidents of the United States. Officially, the FBI kept case files. These documents were meticulously logged, formally indexed, and fully available for review by the Attorney General. But unofficially, J. Edgar Hoover kept a second set of books. This was the real source of his dark, absolute power. He called them the official and confidential files. They were locked away in his personal office suite. Access was strictly forbidden to the rest of the bureau. Only 3 people had the keys to the cabinets: Hoover, his partner Clyde Tolson, and Helen Gandy, his intensely loyal personal secretary. These files did not contain evidence of federal crimes. They contained leverage, extramarital affairs, secret drinking problems, hidden financial ruins, unspoken sexual preferences, unpaid gambling debts. Hoover spent decades aggressively collecting the dirty laundry of every powerful politician, federal judge, military general, and investigative journalist in Washington. He built a comprehensive encyclopedia of human weakness. When Hoover wanted something from a powerful politician, he rarely threatened them directly. He used a psychological torture method that became known in elite circles as the silent reading room. He would invite a senator or a cabinet member into his private office. He would offer them a comfortable seat. Then, he would casually excuse himself to take a phone call in the next room, leaving a single, open file folder resting right on the edge of his immaculate desk. The politician could never resist looking, and inside that folder, they would find their own deepest, darkest, most ruinous secrets staring right back at them, perfectly documented. When Hoover returned to the room, he never said a single word about the file. He didn't scream. He didn't make demands. He just smiled, closed the folder, and asked for his favor. He always got it. Presidents absolutely despised him, but they were paralyzed. Harry Truman hated his guts but didn't dare fire him. Dwight Eisenhower kept his distance. Lyndon Johnson embraced the darkness, famously declaring that it was much better to have Hoover inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. John F. Kennedy actually thought he could control Hoover. JFK was young, wildly popular, and incredibly arrogant. But Hoover had the files. On the 22nd of March 1962, Hoover had a private lunch with President Kennedy inside the White House. We don't know exactly what was said in that room, but we know what Hoover brought with him. The FBI had recently discovered that the President of the United States was having a passionate, reckless affair with a woman named Judith Campbell Exner. The massive problem was that Exner was simultaneously sleeping with Sam Giancana, the ruthless, bloodthirsty boss of the Chicago Mafia. Hoover had the wiretaps. He had the physical proof. The commander-in-chief was essentially sharing a bed with the mob. After that lunch, White House phone logs show Kennedy's calls to Exner stopped completely and permanently. Hoover had just put a leash on the leader of the free world. But blackmailing politicians in quiet rooms was a silent game. When the 1960s exploded into cultural revolution, Hoover unchained his machine in a much louder, much more violent way. He launched a highly classified, totally illegal domestic espionage operation called COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program. The goal was to infiltrate, totally discredit, and violently destroy any political movement Hoover personally deemed radical. And his primary target was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Hoover was obsessively, viciously focused on King. He was absolutely convinced, without a single shred of real, actionable evidence, that King was a communist puppet. Hoover ordered illegal wiretaps planted in King's home and his hotel rooms across the country. Agents recorded his private conversations. They meticulously documented his extramarital affairs. Then, Hoover's FBI moved from surveillance to psychological warfare. In November 1964, just weeks before Dr. King was scheduled to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, an unmarked package arrived at his office in Atlanta. Inside was a spool of audio tape containing recordings from a hotel room, and with it a typed anonymous letter. The letter called King a fraud. It called him a filthy, abnormal beast, and it ended with a chilling, unmistakable ultimatum. It told King there was only one way out. It gave him exactly 34 days to kill himself. The federal government of the United States, operating under the direct orders of J. Edgar Hoover, attempted to blackmail an American Nobel Peace Prize laureate into suicide. But COINTELPRO did not stop at blackmail. It rapidly escalated to blood. The FBI heavily targeted the Black Panther Party. Hoover flooded their organization with paid informants. They forged letters to spark violent paranoia among the members. They deliberately initiated bloody gang wars on the streets. On the 4th of December 1969, heavily armed Chicago police executed a pre-dawn raid on a residential apartment. They were acting on precise, detailed floor plans provided directly by an FBI informant. Inside the apartment was Fred Hampton, a charismatic, 21-year-old rising leader in the Black Panther Party. Hampton never stood a chance. He was shot dead in his bed while sleeping peacefully next to his pregnant fiancée. Hoover had completely transformed the FBI. It was no longer just a law enforcement agency. It had become a weapon of political assassination. It was his personal, untouchable death squad. Hoover had outlasted 8 presidents. He had built a paper empire that seemed immortal. But empires built on paper have one fatal flaw. All it takes is one spark. And on a quiet morning in May 1972, the paper trail was about to catch fire. On the evening of the 1st of May 1972, J. Edgar Hoover ate dinner with Clyde Tolson, just as he had done for over 40 years. He went home, he read for a while, he went to sleep. The next morning, his housekeeper found his body on the bedroom floor. His heart had simply stopped. The 77-year-old tyrant was finally dead. The moment the news hit Washington, the panic was absolute, immediate, and deafening. Politicians did not mourn, they scrambled. The monster was dead, but the monster's teeth were still locked inside his office. Everyone wanted the files. But Helen Gandy was already moving. Within hours of Hoover's death, his furiously loyal secretary locked herself inside his office suite, and the shredders began to scream. For weeks, she destroyed everything in the official and confidential cabinets. When Congress finally demanded answers, she sat under oath and calmly swore she had only destroyed Hoover's purely personal letters. No one believed her. But there was absolutely no way to prove what was in a file that no longer existed. The darkest secrets of the 20th century simply turned into dust. But there was one final, chilling loose end. William Sullivan. Sullivan was a high-ranking FBI official. He was one of the only men who had ever dared to openly challenge Hoover's paranoia. He had called Hoover a fraud to his face. Hoover forced him out, but Sullivan knew too much. After Hoover's death, Sullivan was preparing to testify. He was preparing to blow the whistle and expose the massive, illegal blackmail operations of the FBI to the world. He never got the chance. Shortly before he could testify, William Sullivan went for a walk in the woods near his home. He was shot through the neck with a high-powered rifle and killed instantly. The man who pulled the trigger was a local police officer who claimed he mistook the former FBI executive for a deer. It was officially ruled a hunting accident. No charges were ever filed. The last man who could truly expose the absolute depths of Hoover's empire was silenced forever. The Hollywood films paint J. Edgar Hoover as a tragic, complicated patriot. They soften the blackmail. They soften the destroyed lives. They soften the blood. But history demands the brutal truth. J. Edgar Hoover did not steal his absolute power. It was handed to him. It was handed to him by weak presidents who found his dirt useful, by a cowardly Congress that funded his paranoia, and by an American public that was so terrified of bank robbers, communists, and radicals that they happily traded their freedom for the illusion of safety. We built the monster, we gave him the keys, and we allowed him to file us all away in the dark.